I'm your host, Dr. Stanley Sandler, welcoming you back to Stan the History Man. And today I finished not too long ago this model here of a Soviet car. It's a Gaz, G-A-Z, okay, it's a fitting name for an automobile. And it is an exact copy. Hey, that's a 34 Ford. You're right. It was an exact copy of the 34 Ford. And I dare say the communists, the Soviets, took the plans from the 34 Ford and built this. Now, I read somewhere that this car, when it was, the prototypes were made and so on, and even when they got into production, they had to use hundreds of pounds of lead to fill in the gaps because the stamping machinery and so on, the Soviet Union at that time, this is the 1930s, wasn't really that precise or accurate, and so they had to fill in the gaps with. Uh, anyway, when I built this car, okay, this model, I had to use a whole bunch of modeling clay to fill in the gaps here. Now, to be fair with it, it a lot of detail inside. There's like the grab things you hang on to, in the back seat when you're going around a curve or something. That's there, the speedometer, the instruments, and so on. There's a lot of detail in it, but to putting it together, I spent weeks trying to get it, together without gaps and holes in it, as it were, or gaps. So anyway, now you say, well, that looks kind of fairly decent car. I guess a Soviet uh, peasant or whatever could buy. No, they couldn't. Private citizens could not own automobiles. Well, maybe a few um, top leaders. Well, this kind of a car, maybe a regional Communist Party head, a boss of that kind, what they call the nomenclatura, people who live much better lives because they've got a good government job. In fact, they even had their own telephone system. That's where nomenclatura comes from. That the people that are on this particular. So if you pick up a phone and it works, it's the nomenclatura phone system, because not much else was working under Stalin's Russia or a long time afterwards either. But I think that indicates of just what what automobile industry say. Oh, we produce hundreds, thousands of automobiles, but not for the average person. Even after the war, I mean, when they recovered from the war and some kind of prosperity return, you would have to put you have to wait about 10 years to get a car, and you tell them what kind of car you want. You want a Moskvich or a Gaz, two-door sedan. And that's about all you could tell. You couldn't pick the the color of the car or anything like any of the extras. So it was not the sort of thing walk into a dealership and say, I want this kind of car, and get it tomorrow or something like that once all the titles have cleared and everything. It was a major project. And of course, um, Ronald Reagan, when the president told this joke, he said a guy goes into a store and into the not a dealership but in the office where he ordered a car, and he said, what time? And they said, well, this will be like a decade from now. And he said, what time would that be? And the clerk says, time? I mean, we're talking 10 years. Well, that's when the plumbers do. So consumer interests were not a major thing of the communists. They were building socialism, of course, comrades. So anyway, I just wanted to show that exact copy. Now, another one, top of the line, the Zeiss, which was, well, first was a ZIL, factory named for Lenin, L, and then Zeiss, factory named for Stalin. And these were luxury cars, and they were based upon the Packard. All right. In fact, I've heard that people say, I've looked at some of these Zeisses, especially the pre-war ones, and they'll say Packard Motor Car Company. All right. And Stalin seemed to have liked Packards, and they just make a slight change in the chrome, and there you have the triumph of Soviet engineering, the Zeiss. Actually, and most of the Russian cars weren't all that good. And we all know about the Trabant, of course, which was the worst car ever made, I'm sure. Um, but that was after the war. I don't want to get to that right now, at any rate. But the one car that the communists made and made very well was the Tatra. And I actually have a copy of the Tatra as well. This is a metal model made in Czechoslovakia. This would be one of the early Tatras, about 1934, rear engine. And of course, this is what makes the Tatra unique. That tail fin. Now, tail fins are really like in, Batman movies and so on. But the Tatra is the only company that ever went into mass production, such as mass production was in Czechoslovakia. Was the Tatra, and the story is that Hitler actually saw this model, the Tatra, the early model Tatra, at the Berlin Auto Show in 1934, and there was actually a picture showing Hitler, and he's smiling. These are subhumans, the Czechs, he's smiling at them. He was a motorhead, and he saw this. And there is some evidence that he went back that evening after the show, and he scaled down the Tatra, and hence came the Volkswagen Bug. And there's not absolute proof on that, but there's a lot of indication that was the case. And this car actually, it starts out under a democratic Czechoslovakia, the pre-war Republic of Czechoslovakia, the only country in that part of the world that had democracy. And then of course the Germans, well, we gave it to the British and French, gave Czechoslovakia to the Germans, and they kept production going for the Tatra, and they used them as staff cars during the war. Problem was, this is a lot of weight in the back, and they'd flip. And eventually they issued orders in occupied Czechoslovakia: don't use the Tatra, it's dangerous, it's a killer. And that the Czechs called it the Czechoslovakia's secret weapon. Well, after the war, when the Soviet Union liberated, air quotes, liberated Czechoslovakia, they kept the Tatra going and came out with several models later on. Now, this is a top of the line car. It's a luxury car. And so only, again, the top bonzes or moguls of the Communist Party got them, and not just the region doctors. I mean, it had to be like a provincial chief of the Communist Party. Actually, one was made for Stalin. It was a convertible, and it's still around in a museum, I guess, in the Soviet Union. But eventually, the Tatra stopped making cars, I think, about 20 years ago, and continued making trucks. So, automobiles in the communist countries were something that were, a luxury, and even the cheapest ones ever. And finally, I'll talk about the worst communist automobile, the Trabant, which many of you know about. Well, it was made out of they had a surplus of cotton cloth, or cotton waste, as it were, raw cotton. And so let's make auto body out of it. So what they did was they soaked it in some kind of a rosin, and that dried out, and that they made a body, stamped a body out of it. So the body was made out of old rags or cotton waste, something like that. And but the car was so cheap. I mean, I was reading one guy, he said he went to open up the hood, the hood latch, and it came off in his hand. It was made out of plastic, the hood latch. I mean, this wasn't the emblem, right? It was the hood latch was made out of plastic. You open up, it goes off in your hand. And all kinds of jokes about the Trabant too. As a matter of fact, there are people who collect them just as conversation pieces. And many of them, when the wall came down, many were driven by East Germans, fortunate East Germans who had a car, into West Germany, abandoned there. But here's the thing: the cars had a sting in its death, because that resin that impregnated, that made the body, was attracted to cattle, and they chew on the body and die. Okay, isn't that kind of a parable or a metaphor of, of communism? All right, so there's only one really good car that could match Western standard specifications, but that was a luxury car for the nomenclature. So I guess actually the story of automobiles is in communist countries is a parable on that sort of thing. Well, I hope you enjoyed hearing about the rather obscure topic of communist automobiles, and I look forward to talking with you again on another episode of Stan the History Man. Talk to you later. Bye bye.